David, I'm so glad to see you. It's been, I don't know how long it's been since we've texted or called, but it's been a while since I've seen you in person.
Yeah, it's great to see you again.
David and I know each other, but I'm going to try to channel my David Yeager ignorant self and begin with the most obvious question, but I think it's the best question to begin with, which is, David Yeager, why did you write this book?
Yeah, so I wrote 10 to 25, really just to capture about a decade and a half of research that we had done. So just as a backstory, I was a middle school teacher. It was my first job out of college. And I loved being in the classroom, but I felt like there were a lot of challenges. I mean, really getting young people to master the complexities of writing essays and grammar, all those things, those are hard. But I even struggled to do things like get them to line up and walk down the hallway without punching each other. Stuff
Where
like
were you
that.
teaching?
Tulsa, Oklahoma.
Tulsa, Oklahoma.
And I left the classroom ultimately because I felt like I wanted to do research on better approaches. And for me, I wanted to stand in front of rooms of parents, teachers, youth workers, et cetera, and be able to say, look, if you say this, it's going to be more effective than if you say that. Like the clarity of the experimental method was kind of my North Star. And for a long time, as you know, we had a lot of success. We published a lot of papers, and ultimately, a big insight was that we need to also address the adults in the room who are working with young people, and we have to think about what approaches they're taking and how do we influence them to try to change their behavior. And that led me on this journey of learning to write the book. And so I spent a long time tracking down great mentors, expert managers, coaches.
Like the adults who are getting it right.
Yeah, the people getting it right, and then to some level the people who are not getting it right. And I wanted to figure out what they did and distill that and share it with the world.
So you think that a lot of adults do have things wrong about this age group, and actually let me just ask you about the title, 10 to 25. So I think when people think of adolescence, they probably think of the teenage years, but 10 to 25 suggests that adolescence precedes the teenage years, or at least 10 and 11, 12,
yeah.
Right? And then extends beyond 18. So can you say anything about what is special about this developmental period and why you have extended it beyond teenage years?
Yeah, so there's two reasons for the title 10 to 25. One is that I can have an infinite number of sequels. So get ready for 26.5 to 26.6.
Yes,
thanks to the number line. But the real reason is look, pubertal maturation starts around 10. And specifically, there are two axes in puberty, adrenarche and gonadarche. Adrenarche is like kind of cortisol, ends up in oily skin, that kind of thing. Gonadarche is an increase in testosterone, estradiol. That's preparing you for sexual maturation.
Yeah, reproduction.
And that stuff happens even if you don't see it. So a 10-year-old can still look like they're Tanner stage 1, which is a staging for puberty, but underneath they could already have this massive surge in testosterone that's affecting their brains. So scientists are kind of wise to the impact of those hormones on reward sensitivity in the brain in those earlier years, which is why they're a critical period. So that's why it goes down to 10. 25, well, adolescence is defined as generally taking on an adult-like role in the culture. And in our global economy, that happens later and later and later. And so 25 is a kind of average of when that tends to happen in our culture. And the neuroscientists are now showing that the brain is still developing even in that period.
Past the 25.
But it's not, so it's a biological onset, a sociocultural offset. But the key inside of the book is that there are influences of pubertal maturation on the brain that continue to shape what motivates young people throughout that range. So the kinds of things that tend to motivate a 24-year-old are surprisingly far more similar to the things that motivate a 10-year-old than people think.
And so let's get to the heart of that, because this is the, you take a provocative and I think it's like not a very well-known stance about like how to understand this age group, because there's a lot of complaining about this age group. By the way, is this Gen Z? Am I correct? Is it 10 to 25 Gen Z? Or is it like a different
yeah,
gen?
and then I think there's the one behind it, Alpha. I mean, there's always someone trying to sell a consulting around some letter generation.
The next generation.
And they can just cycle through all the letters every few years.
So what do we get wrong about this generation? I mean, this age group, right? Not necessarily when they were born, but this developmental period. What do we get wrong about adolescence? And Yeah, and then correct us. Like, give us your theory.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. There's a narrative about young people that they are incompetent, short-sighted, selfish, impulsive, as you know, and that's not a new idea. You can look back at Aristotle in the Rhetoric, complaining about
Socrates,
young people,
I think.
right? And yeah, I mean, you could read Aristotle writing about teenagers, and it could look like an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal that you could have read yesterday.
Kids these days.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's been going on forever.
Yeah.
And there's a classic idea in Plato in the Phaedrus, which is a dialogue, and the idea is that there are two winged horses that are like Pegasus, that are unruly and that are kind of spiraling around, unable to be controlled, and then a charioteer kind of needs to lash them enough to discipline those passions. And that idea of an emotional brain and like a rational, problem-solving, thinking, logical brain, whereas in the latter has to control the former, that's just a classic idea in the Western tradition, and then it became kind of codified in our neuroscientific literature in the 90s. So you didn't have to read philosophy to get this idea of the teenage brain being all gas and no brakes. And there's a reason why that was a popular idea. So some work by people who we like and know and admire showed that if teenagers aren't able to control their impulses, then it doesn't make sense to give them, for example, life without parole or the death penalty if they do some heinous crime.
Right.
And so scientists successfully lobbied to the Supreme Court in multiple cases to outlaw the juvenile death penalty and the juvenile.
You mentioned this in the book, right? In the MacArthur, I think it's the Research
MacArthur
Network. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's important work. But once you conclude that young people make irrational decisions and can't be trusted to make their own choices, then you can start creeping into other things. Like, well, maybe they shouldn't decide who they have relationships with, or whether they have sex, or if they use contraception. Maybe young people, under 25 shouldn't be allowed to vote if their brains are still developing. And there's a kind of cultural idea that I call the neurobiological incompetence model. And the idea is that teenagers' brains are awash in hormones, and there's a disconnect between the prefrontal part and the rest of the brain, the limbic regions. And because of that, they're incapable of thinking carefully. But that model is overly simplified, and even though it was ethically applied to some important legal cases, when applied in general to thinking about all young people, it leads adults to do some pretty dumb stuff that never works with young people. And it leads young people to, in turn, feel kind of outraged and disrespected, and it actually leads us to create some of the very problems that we complain about as a society.
So let's get specific before I ask you to say more about this, natural, for lack of a better word, like need for status and respect that underlies your theory. But let's get really specific. It's like, for example, what would a mom or a dad do wrong?
Yeah.
Well-intentioned but wrong in terms of like managing their high school junior son or daughter.
Yeah. So if you start from the neurobiological incompetence model, the idea is that young people can't think rationally about important decisions. And so if you're concerned about them, then you as the adult, whether you're a parent or a manager or a teacher, you should do the thinking, and then you should impart that reason that you came up with in your mind to the young person. I call this grown-splaining. And I'm now going to mansplain grown-splaining to you.
Great.
And so grown-splaining is simply the idea that we think about what's a logical and good decision, and then we convince ourselves that if only we say it enough and loudly enough to the young person,
and again,
then they will make a good choice. And if they don't, it's because they're recalcitrant, rebellious, like
adolescents.
That. Right. And adults often act like Americans visiting foreign countries when they don't speak the language. Like, you're in Italy and you meet someone who only speaks Italian, and then you just yell English at them louder.
Yeah.
Right?
All caps, bold.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like pasta, and then I don't know what they're talking about. That's how we talk to teenagers. And I read about this study that I love. Ron Dahl, our friend and collaborator, wrote about what happens in the teenage brain when moms nag their daughters. And they I
have a daughter in the audience, and just trigger warning for the daughter. Yeah.
It could have been dads and sons, or any of the other combinations, but it happens to be moms and daughters. And the way that the study works is they had moms record themselves finishing the sentence, "What bothers me about you is." So it's like you're already not off to a good start. Right, yeah, this is a trigger warning situation for a lot of people. And then they bring the daughters in to the fMRI machine, and it's a huge magnet that whirs around in their heads. And it's detecting blood flow in different regions of the brain as the daughter is listening to the mom complete that sentence. So an example in the study is
her own mom.
Yeah, it's their own mom that did it in advance. And then the teenage daughter, this is a very real scientific study with lots of acronyms and lots of brain pictures. And it says the following, something like, I tell you to take your shoes downstairs and you don't ever do it. I tell you not to yell at your sister and you keep yelling at her. I walk past your room and I say, this needs sweeping and dusting, and you don't do anything about it. You just need to calm that down. And I'll tell you what doesn't happen. The daughter doesn't say, you know, Mom, you've got a point.
Yeah, I love that perspective. I had never thought of those things.
Yeah, like I'm really glad that I now have this very clear list of things to change.
It's amazing.
And I can't wait to get to work, so good job.
Yeah.
So that's not what happens.
That's not what happens.
No.
Shocking.
Instead, what you see is an increase in anger regions of the brain.
Yeah.
So a network related to affect. And then you see a decrease in prefrontal regions, specifically the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex.
Which is reason and logic.
Reason, logic, that's the charioteer,
yeah.
right? That's shut off. And then the third is super interesting, is the social cognition, so the temporal-parietal junction. So if people have seen Sarah Jane Blakemore's TED Talks, she talks a lot about, that's the kind of mind-reading section of the brain.
Yeah.
And it's not immediately obvious why that's important, but think back on what the mom
So this gets activated or
said.
or
so
deactivated?
That's turned off.
That's turned off, deactivated.
The mind reading, social mind reading is turned off. And that's important because a lot of times what adults say is there's an unspoken part of it where the young person has to infer the meaning and then, especially to make a choice.
Right, which happens in all conversation, right?
Yeah,
like you have to infer meaning.
But there are more or less literal ways to talk, and often, so take the example I said of the mom walks by and says, your room needs sweeping and dusting.
Right.
You know, it needs to be cleaned. Taking that literally, right, the daughter could be like, you're right, someone should clean this room.
Right.
Like it needs sweeping and dusting.
Yeah.
Right.
Good
I wonder
point.
who's going to do that.
Yeah.
Right. But the mom thinks it's clear as day. I told you to clean the room.
Right.
And the kid's interpreting it literally and not thinking that. So it's like mom is like, I told you to do this. The kid's like, that's an interesting observation. And mom's like, why are you not doing what I say? And the kid's like, why is this lunatic yelling at me?
Because you think, in part, because they have this anger response and because they are shutting off, because they feel like their rights have been violated, right? Like a lack of status and respect in that.
Their rights are violated.
Because I don't think there are a lot of teenagers who are like, oh, I literally just thought you meant that the room had to be cleaned up by a human.
Well, they have self-interested reason to draw that conclusion, right?
Fair. Yeah.
And teenagers love to like throw their parents' words back in their faces.
Yes.
Be as literal as possible.
Yes.
And so that's an example of grown-splaining, like what happens in the teenage brain. And then as you've alluded to, my argument is that anytime you threaten core needs like competence, autonomy, relatedness for a young person, then it makes them feel disrespected. And the teenage brain doesn't like being disrespected, in part because one of the things that puberty is doing is it's trying to make you go out and find a way to feel respected in your culture, to gain a reputation as someone who has value and who is worthwhile. And so a parent has like caused a conflict with the core motivation of the young person.
You have now imperiled the one thing
the number one
that
thing they're
they
interested in.
care about.
Yeah.
And you use status and respect in the book, I think usually together, status and respect. Is there any difference between those? I mean, do you want to say?
Well, it's...
Like, what is it psychologically? What
the
is
umbrella
status?
is more your social standing. And the reason why, just in English, those words have overlapping meaning, and I want to capture both of them. What I don't mean is just how many likes you get on Facebook, or
it's not popularity. It's social standing.
And I'm influenced a lot by the evolutionary anthropologist. This isn't my field, but I'm summarizing. I've interviewed a lot of these people, and what they argue is that in our evolutionary history, when humans are on the savannah. When you're a child, the parent takes care of you. You wander around from resource to resource, and the parent takes care of you, not because the 4-year-old is good at foraging, but because the 4-year-old is your child. You care
Right.
for them.
You're helpless.
But if you're
in a
like
way, yeah.
14 and you bring nothing to the table, and everyone else is like killing enemies to protect you and bringing you, like, no one's going to keep you around anymore.
So the developmental challenge of this stage is to have a contribution, like to have a meaningful,
have a contribution that is seen by others
and respected,
who are
and
socially
appreciated.
valued in the group. So it's what the anthropologists call earned prestige. You have to have done something in the eyes of others whose opinions you care about and whose opinions matter for the social success of the group, to prevent them basically from abandoning you and leaving you behind. In the animal world, so I write about this interesting work by a bunch of chimp researchers. I didn't think I was going to write about chimps when I started the book, but then I met...
But there's adolescence in other,
Yeah,
actually, and I think all mammals.
Some of the most interesting adolescence research is with chimps, and I interviewed these Harvard anthropologists who every
Joe
summer...
Henrich?
What's that?
Is it Joe Henrich's lab?
No.
Okay.
He doesn't do primates stuff.
No, that's true. But he's a...
But so they're, one of them, Aaron Sandell, is now at UT where I work. And every summer they go to Africa and they sit right on the edge of this park where the chimps are. And they wake up at 4 o'clock and they've got like a long pole with like a bucket. And so they wait for the chimps to pee at 4 in the morning and have to catch the pee to like test the hormones. So they know everyone's pubertal status at all times because they're catching their pee every morning. And it's a very interesting life. I don't personally want to do it. But and then they just watch the chimps all day and they take notes. And chimps, just like humans, start puberty around 10. And the mom stops protecting the 9 and 10-year-old chimp. And they now let the 9 and 10-year-old chimp go basically be in the town square with all the other adolescent and mature and adult chimps. And if they read the situation wrong, like if a skinny, nerdy 10-year-old chimp tries to mate with another chimp they're not supposed to, they'll like rip it to shreds. They'll beat the absolute shit out of it.
Right, because we are also a deeply hierarchical species.
It's deeply hierarchical. And so getting status stuff wrong is literally life and death for not getting beaten up and destroyed. But also, you'll never mate if you don't know the hierarchy, because you'll never figure out who you are allowed to mate with. And so basically you die alone if you don't figure out status and respect.
So this deep evolutionarily preserved or generated need for status and respect, for social standing. Let's go back to the mom and the hypothetical mom, the hypothetical daughter, and the hypothetical messy room. And I will try not to project onto this. But what advice, what should the mother do or say in that situation? Yeah,
so we've done a bunch of experiments on how surprisingly small differences in communication can have a profound effect on young people's willingness to take the actions that the adults in their lives want them to take. One example is an experiment we did on medication adherence. So this is, if people have read the book, it's the Vegemite study. And so the setup for the study is that, and I'm not sure if you know this, but 50% of all teenagers who have gotten an organ transplant don't take their anti-rejection meds. So they've got the kidney.
And by the way, to the credit of teenagers, 50% of adults who need to take their statins don't take their statins.
Adherence is bad.
We are not good at giving ourselves.
But just like the crime curve, it peaks from 10 to 25. So it's like, it's
the lack of adherence.
Yeah, the lack of adherence. It gets better every year after 25. And 50% of cancer patients, like teenagers who are outpatients, they don't take their oral chemo. Now, the conventional view is to grown-splain the health consequences of their actions, right? So you're not taking your medicine.
If you don't do this, then...
Right. And I interviewed tons of transplant recipients, and the main thing doctors say to them is, we're going to increase your meds, we're going to force you to come back. It's basically threats, escalating threats. And what I thought was, well, maybe there's a social status and respect issue happening here. And I think there are two. One is that taking your meds every day is, there are social costs to it. So for instance, I interviewed this one kid who had to take basically 2 fistfuls of steroids every day to stop some inflammation. And so he'd go to a party and then have to like hide in the bathroom and have like pockets full of steroids, And then his other meds made it so he couldn't drink. He had super bad breath. and gave him like erectile problems.
Wow, this
So
is
it's like what
amazing
does a normal
combination,
teenage
yeah.
boy want to do at a party, right?
Right.
It's like it's make out, et cetera, make out and drink. And so the meds are like preventing you from doing the normal teenager thing. And they know they don't want to go back on dialysis and lose the kidney. They're fully aware. They don't need anyone to grown-splain that to them. And so, so one is that there are social consequences of feeling weird and different. The other is the way doctors often talk to patients is very disrespectful. So it'll be like the teenager and the mom, usually, and then they'll talk directly to the mom, not the teenager. And the conversation will mostly be about how to threaten and twist the arm of your teenager who will inevitably screw up. And that's what they do in front of the kid. And so the kid's like, all right, well, first of all, I've learned my mom's in charge, not me. Second of all, I've learned everyone thinks I'm an idiot, so why would I do anything any different, right? And so we did an experiment to just test the effect of better communication. Now, you can't do an experiment with real transplant recipients because I don't want my control group to like die or lose a kidney, right? Because it's like, we crapped on you, and now you don't have a kidney, and yay, our study's published. Like, we don't want to do that.
right.
So we needed a medicine that was unpleasant, it was as inconvenient as the 2 fistfuls of steroids that has side effects, but it was presented to them as plausibly healthy and good for them. And so that's why we turned to having them eat a spoonful of Vegemite. Right. So if you don't know Vegemite, I highly recommend.
Or Marmite.
Well, we tried both, and we had in our lab, we did a taste test, and Vegemite was twice as bad in terms of rating.
I thought they were just the same
So there was a lot of piloting. My student who later worked under Tim Wilson, she also tried snorting Tabasco sauce, which was just, we were worried about lawsuits, so we didn't do that.
Yeah.
And then I was like, wait, I'm your employer, and you did that, so we should not talk about that.
Yeah.
I did not tell her to do that, I will
tonight.
say.
Yeah.
At any rate, so we settled on a spoonful of Vegemite. If you don't know what it is, I encourage you to Google the YouTube video, Americans Eating Australian Foods. And the section where they eat the Vegemite is the funniest part of that video by far. So Vegemite is, imagine you brewed a barrel of beer and then you took out all the beer and all you had left was the yeast.
The sludge.
And then you put that on toast.
Yeah.
So we had 18 to 25-year-olds take huge spoonfuls of Vegemite to sample it. They all know it's bad. And then we had a doctor on video.
I know it tastes bad.
They know it tastes bad to Americans.
Yeah.
In other countries, it's an acquired taste. They like it. But in the U.S., it's considered disgusting. And in lots of other countries, too. And so we either ask them respectfully in a grown-splaining, or disrespectfully in a grown-splaining way, or respectfully. And it turns out that little subtleties, so for instance, not saying you should or you have to, but instead saying things like you might consider, that kind of thing made a difference. Mm-hmm. Also, in our disrespectful condition, we said things like, I'm the doctor, I'm an expert, I know what I'm doing, therefore you should listen to me. In the respectful condition, it was, and these were UT undergrads, so it's like, look, you're a UT student, you're gonna understand the real reason for this, let me explain the real reason for it. We also framed the whole experiment as you're contributing to science. So in the disrespectful condition, we said, there may be an unpleasant taste, try to ignore that, which is impossible to do. In the respectful condition, there might be an unpleasant taste. Think of that as you doing your part to help others in advanced science.
Right, so reframing that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And when it was framed as you have a choice and you're making a difference and I value your opinion and I think you're smart, then they were twice as likely to take the Vegemite. And then the interesting thing is that we also tested the impact of testosterone. So these were young adults, but we could temporarily turn them into teenagers with a nasal inhaler of testosterone. So for people who started out as low T, they did an inhaler where it was testosterone, or one where we told them it was and it wasn't, so it was a placebo. And we found that they became hypersensitive to the difference between being asked respectfully or not. And what that suggests is that a lot of the most frustrating kids these days' behavior might be in part a response to how we're communicating with them, and then which should give us pause and make us think about how good we're doing as a society. And certainly if the smartest doctors in the world can't figure out how to get more than half of adolescent patients to take medicine, then clearly as a society we're doing something wrong. But the optimistic part is that there are ways of influencing young people by being attuned to our communication. And there's a clinic at Stanford where my wife was a nurse. She was a pediatric nurse practitioner. She used to work at the PICU. And the liver clinic doesn't have the high non-adherence rates. They have teenagers who take their meds, but it's a whole status and respect thing that they do from the moment that the young person gets their transplant. They talk to the young person, not the parents. They get young people to feel like their liver is a gift, and they're honoring the person who gave it to them every time they take their meds. So every single day is like a status reinforcement of your value as a person, your leadership, your wisdom. And then they also put them in communities. So they're in, like, they go to summer camps together, et cetera. And that, to me, suggests that there's something to this idea of, instead of thinking the adolescent brain is irretrievably incompetent, it's instead something where we need to be more aware of how we're communicating and what the status and respect implications of certain behaviors are, so that we can then optimize both how we communicate with them and then how we present things to them.
So let's apply this perspective to something that has been talked about a lot recently, which is social media.
Yeah.
And smartphones, et cetera. So we've had brief conversations about this, but as some of the people in this room know, there is a best-selling book by John Haidt, who's at NYU, that argues that social media is one of, I think he's very careful to say one of, but
he says it's the main cause.
Okay, of the rising tide of anxiety and depression, and loneliness, essentially mental health problems in adolescents. And there is a rising tide. I don't think anybody is going to disagree with that. So as to researchers who study adolescents, we believe there is a rising tide of adolescents.
We've been tracking it for 10 years, for sure.
Right, and I think it goes back 20, right? So what's the David Yeager perspective on this issue? Because as you were about to say, I think, there are academics on the other side of this, debate, I will call it, because it's an argument.
Yeah, I have reviewed the literature, but I'll just say that the editor of Science Magazine, who's the
Nature. I think it's Nature.
Candace published something in Nature.
Right.
Candace Odgers, and then the editor of Science Magazine wrote an editorial.
Oh, it was the editor of Science. I thought it was the editor.
The overall editor. And it's very rare for the editor of a scientific magazine to say, look, these people are using the science all wrong.
Right, and science is, again, I think this audience knows, Science and Nature are
it's the premier outlet in the world.
Those are the
certainly in America. Yeah. Came out and said, look, Haidt's misrepresenting the science. There's all kinds of ethical issues with that. I don't need to review that, but I refer people to that research. Here are the things that are generally well accepted. Every year since the Great Recession, teenage mental health problems went up. So the rate of clinically significant anxiety and depression has increased. Interestingly, other teenage risk behaviors have gone down. So teenage pregnancy, car crashes, crime. So on all those things that we were really worried about in the 90s, about the coming wave of a crime wave of teenagers, almost all those things have gone down since then, but mental health problems have gotten worse, as have really just opportunities to get in the labor market. So economic inequality, educational inequality has gone up every year. There are a lot of people who think that those two things are related. That the feeling like you're supposed to toil away right now as a young person, factoring trinomials and doing stoichiometry and basically delaying gratification for the promise of a better grade and a better college and a good job so I could hardly afford a mortgage in my 30s. That's the idea that that's the promise for your self-control now, and that promise is less and less true for fewer and it's less and less true for more and more people in America right now than it has at any age since the Gilded Age, according to some sociologists. It's possible that that's a major cause of anxiety, but there are lots of other causes that make sense too. In addition to the economic inequality and so on, there's global wars, there's pandemic, there's global warming, there's just a host of problems that young people are aware of. and concerned about, and they're often talked about more and more and more by an always-on news media culture. So every headline is all caps, breaking news, breaking crisis, et cetera. And so I think there's a lot of reason to think that just the problems of the world that young people are more and more aware of is a reasonable cause for a big part of the anxiety epidemic. I'll say that I told my 14-year-old daughter about the anxious generation, and I was like, Scarlett, so there's this guy who says that your generation has an anxiety problem. She's like, well, that sounds right to me. I believe that. And then she's like, well, why does he think it's happening? It's like, oh, because of your phones. And she's like, well, that's not true. I don't have a phone, and I'm super anxious. And I was like, well, what do you think the cause is? And she's like, well, it's obvious. Like, what do you mean? It's like, it's obvious to every single teenager. Like, what do you mean? And it's like, the world is ending, and your generation is doing nothing about it. Like, all you guys do is like bicker and complain. And it's like, my team is this, and your team is that. And it's like, you don't solve anything. Like, show me a law that you've passed since 2009. It's like, you don't do anything. And my generation is gonna have to clean up your mess. And then you only talk to young people for like 6 weeks before an election, and then you go back to not caring about us. And the takeaway from me is I have to trust the baby boomers. Well, like, you had your chance, baby boomers. So like, it's an interesting conversation with a 14-year-old. Yeah. But like, I think that's true for at least some kids, that they are, young people are hyper attuned to unfairness in the world. That's just like, ask any kid, what's something wrong with the world? They will tell you immediately. And you know, you're co-PI on our purpose research. Mm-hmm. We surveyed a nationally representative sample of freshmen. And they tell me something problematic with the world. And 90-something% of kids filled out that question. They didn't have to.
It was not hard for them to think of things that were wrong in the world.
And if they're thinking about that a lot and they think that no one's gonna fix it, that's a totally
Do you think there's no role of social media and smartphones? Or?
Well, so we, as you know, my student Hayan Lee and I, we did a series of experiments on social media, and we randomized teenagers to join a social media network that we'd created. It was like Facebook, and they post something about themselves, and then we tell them they're joining a group of other people who are all logged on at the same time, and over 5 minutes, you have the chance to like everyone else's posts.
So you like created an experimental social media.
We created an experimental controlled social media, and we randomized whether the kid participants in our study either got the second most likes out of 12 people or the second fewest likes out of 12 people. And what's interesting is there's no comments, so no one got insulted, trolled, made fun of.
It's just like thumbs up, thumbs down.
It was
well, just thumbs up.
Just thumbs up.
Yeah,
There's
just
so
like
no
real social
negative
media.
feedback.
Right. Yeah.
And kids felt terrible if they were the second fewest. It was like one of the biggest effects we've ever studied. About half standard deviation to a full standard deviation on self-esteem, other things like that. So insufficiently positive feedback itself was a negative stressor, which is interesting because a lot of people think it's the cyberbullying, it's all the...
Right. It's the absence of likes or the delay of right?
Relative to others.
Relative
so
to others,
comparison to what
which
you
of
think
course
you
they are
have.
always doing.
Yeah. And so I think the plausible story for social media harming mental health is that you have more access to impossible standards than ever before.
Comparative social information where you are never going to be at the very top, right?
And as you know, Dan Gilbert's research and other people, right, that one of the best ways to kill happiness is to compare yourself to people who have more. And
I think it was Herman Melville who said, comparison is the thief of joy.
Really? He's a good guy. I should.
It's very Melville.
Was he an author?
Call me Ishmael, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
100 pages about whaling.
I skipped all the whaling chapters.
Yeah, me too.
But
so anyway, Dan Gilbert, I think, compelling research that if you do upward comparisons, it kind of makes you less satisfied with what you have now. So I think that a plausible role of social media is that you're exposed to examples that you can never live up to, and those examples are, in a fake way, making it seem like they're normal people that anyone could attain, but a lot of it is manufactured impressions, or they're just super outliers.
So what is the cell phone policy in the Yeager household? How does Scarlett not have a cell phone?
Oh, well, mainly I just don't want to deal with it. I mean, like, I don't think...
So do any of your kids have cell phones? How old are your kids?
But they have iPads. I mean, they can talk to people. Yeah, I'm not worried about cell phones for mental health. I'm worried because they're super distracting. You have to think about them all the time.
Right, right. So you're worried more just in terms of like how they're displacing your attention from.
Yeah, like I was on the basketball team and take the bus to the game, and everyone, they'd ride back. That's when I had the most fun, was like
actually talking to people.
Just BSing on the bus, and everyone was just on their phone the whole time.
So you're not saying that cell phones aren't an issue to worry about. You're just saying that like a direct link to the mental health.
But to expect the increase in access to cell phones to track with the overall
explain the trend in adolescent
trend in health problems, it also has to not have positive effects. And there's a ton of evidence that it
Well,
does
it could have positive effects. It could just be that the negative effects are bigger than the positive.
Right, or they cancel out. And so the kids who tend to have the highest rates of mental health problems of anxiety and depression are kids who have marginalized identities. So often like queer youth, trans youth, minoritized youth, et cetera. And kids in those communities get more access to supportive voices and people from social media than they could in a world where those things didn't exist. So there's a lot of research on this, that young people who feel othered, marginalized, et cetera, can get social support that they often couldn't get.
Sort of a safe harbor in certain, because they can find a virtual community.
And then for any kid, social media is a place to speak out about injustice. And that's a lot of what happened in COVID, right? Was young people, people blame social media for mental health problems during COVID, but it was also a huge source of activism. And so banning, cell phones in general is also potentially a way of silencing young people's voices. And so something that could provide mental health support for young people could be taken away.
So let's talk about an adolescent subgroup that a lot of people are worried about these days, boys.
Yeah.
So as we both know from our separate and collective research, boys underperform girls now academically. They apply to college at lower rates, they enroll in college at lower rates, they graduate at lower rates. So tell me about 10 to 25 and boys versus girls.
Yeah, and I'll just say this is a huge problem. A lot of people have written about this. I'm not in no way the only authority. But I also have 3 boys, one of them is 7th grader, so it's something I'm super worried about. In a study that you helped on, the National Study of Learning Mindsets, we surveyed kids in 76 public schools randomly selected from across the country, and then we tracked them through the end of high school through their transcripts, so we know every course they took, and then into college through the National Student Clearinghouse, a database that you can follow people over time. So we have the most recent longitudinal study of boys' high school course-taking grades and then progress to and through college. And I think this year was their 6th year of college, so when they should have been graduating. And what we find is that college freshmen are about 60 to 65% girls, and then boys make up the
2 to 1.
So there's a huge disparity there. And we can trace that disparity more or less to 9th grade. I mean, that's when our study starts. I'm sure it started earlier. And a big contributor is that boys are far less likely to make the next step in the academic chain, like to make progress in math and science, for example. So the normal sequence of math is algebra 1, geometry.
Good to dispel all the stereotypes, by the way. Girls do better than boys in STEM classes, all STEM classes. And,
well, and
academic in grades anyway.
When we have micro level, they're doing twice as much homework is the big thing.
Yeah.
And so so boys are much less likely to go from algebra 1 to geometry. They just stay in algebra 1. And then SES, socioeconomic status, is involved as well. So low SES boys in America, from the most recent data, about 25% of the time did not progress to the next math class in the sequence.
So 1 out of 4.
1 out of 4, and it was only 4% of high SES girls. And SES has the same effect as gender, so you can kind of do the math to separate between. And so then that raises interesting questions, like, well, what's going on with the classroom? And what happens a lot of the times is a lot of it is how teachers do discipline and how teachers deal with mistakes. So a conventional teacher thinks about a kid's mistake on a test or a quiz as the teacher already explained it to the kid chose not to listen because they were goofing off, And the fact that they chose not to listen means that they are rebellious, that they are goof off, that they don't care.
They're insolent.
And so a mistake is a character problem in a lot of teachers' minds. And so their response to the student mistake, like a kid can't figure out the nonlinear function problems, for example. The response is to say, I already explained this to you. You have to go review what I already told you before I'll help you. So now teachers are trying to teach responsibility. And I get that kids need to learn how to be responsible for their stuff and be held accountable. But a kid who's like legitimately confused about nonlinear functions is basically being told that their intellectual confusion is a moral, ethical problem.
Right.
And that's disrespectful. So because a core cause of disrespect, like if you ask kids what made you feel disrespected, one of the first things they'll say is an adult made an assumption about me that was unfair and
untrue.
Yeah, and I'll give you a concrete example. In the book, I read about this guy named Sergio Estrada, who's, I think, America's greatest equity promoting teacher, at least according to analysis I did of only Texas. But as a Texan, then Texas, if you're the best in Texas, you must be the best in the world.
Yeah.
And that logic is airtight. I don't want to hear any debates about that. Anyway, Sergio's fabulous, teaches at Riverside High School in El Paso. It's called Riverside because it's right on the border. You can see Mexico out the window. And he has kids who walk an hour from Mexico, wait, cross, and go back. So they're commuting 2 hours each way. 2% of his kids are college ready if you look at SATs. And 95% of his kids pass college physics every single semester. He's an amazing teacher, and I write about him throughout the book. Carol Dweck and I called him every Friday for about 3 years. And one day I called him on a Friday, and during his off period, and if you ever spent much time in urban public schools, kids are just wandering the halls at all times for no reason. And so, and no one, because the school's kind of like, we're glad you're here at least, even though you're wandering the halls. Because it's over 16, like they don't have to go, right? The truancy officers can't go to their houses. So when kids don't feel like doing anything, they wind up in their favorite teacher's class. And so Sergio always had like 5 to 10 straggling
extra kids.
Yeah, which meant I got to talk to these kids. And so anyway, one time this kid, Emiliano, and Sergio's like, look, if you saw this kid, you would judge him. He has like tattoos under his eye, like a money bag. It's got a big neck tattoo. He's huge. But I talked to him, and he was just like a sensitive kid. And I was like, hey, Emiliano, who's the opposite of Sergio? Who's the anti-Sergio teacher at your class? He's like, oh, it's my English teacher. I was like, oh, what does she do? He's like, well, we had an assignment where we had to write an essay with 2 sides, like pro and con. And I could only think of half. So I went to the teacher's class after school and asked for help on the other half. I was like, I only got half. And she told him, tú no lo entiendes porque no quieres, which is, you didn't understand it because you didn't want to. And he was almost in tears as he told me this. And he's like, it was so unfair to assume that about me. And I was like, what do you mean? And he said, I have ADHD. I only understand half of what anybody says to me. Like, this is how I get the other half.
He also has a great sense of humor.
Like, I couldn't possibly have wanted more to get the information than to spend my own time and come after class and talk to a teacher who normally trashes me. So the teacher's mind, she's like, I already explained it, read this stack of papers, you need to be accountable. In Emiliano's mind, he's like, I'm being earnest here. And I think that kind of thing happens a lot, where I think teachers are trying to help kids, and parents too, be accountable, be a role model, do what's right. Future. But it comes across in a way that's hyper disrespectful. And Emiliano's not going to go the extra mile and work hard in her class, ever. And he told me that. And I think that happens a lot in classes.
We have some questions from the audience, and I know we don't have much time left, only a few minutes before David does a book signing, which he looks forward to. I'm going to say that this question is about, teaching young people about, are we being too accommodating? And I know backstage you wanted to bring up the question of neurodiversity.
Yeah.
And so if that's our final question, depends on how much you have to say about it, then we'll end there. And if not, we'll have one more after that.
Yeah. The question is about accommodations?
Are
it's being too accommodating?
Yeah, and if whatever you wanted to say about neurodiversity, which I think is related to this question.
So one thing I hear a lot is when I say young people need status and respect, adults are like, no, they need to respect me. Like they're out of line, they're disrespecting me, they don't respect my authority, and I'll respect them when they do.
Once they respect me, yeah.
Right. And a lot of it comes around the word listening. So an adult, I mean, I'm guilty of this too, when an adult says my kid doesn't listen to me, what they mean is my kid doesn't do exactly what I said the first time with no complaining, right? That's what listen means.
Compliance,
to adults.
right.
Is like unquestioned compliance, immediate. A kid says my parents don't listen to me. They mean they didn't understand me and my needs as a person. That's very different from unquestioned compliance. And so I think there's this tension where adults think kids need to prepare for a real world. They don't need to be coddled, and we don't need to cater to them all the time. And I sympathize with that idea. But I don't think treating someone with dignity and respect is coddling them. I think it's empowering them. And so in the book, I write about this idea of a mentor mindset, which is that you have very high standards. So you demand a lot. You're preparing them for a tough, rigorous future. But you're supportive enough so they can meet that standard. And that comes across respectfully because I'm expecting a lot of you because I think a lot of you. I think you have a lot of potential. But I'm not leaving you alone. The adults who say they have to respect me before I respect them, they have what I call an enforcer mindset. And that's very demanding standards, but no support.
Without the respect,
or little
and without
support.
the support, yeah.
And that comes across very disrespectfully because you're like an authoritarian dictator, right? It's like you're not happy unless, like in the movie Whiplash, where Miles Teller's hands are bleeding because he's practicing drums so much. And in an enforcer mindset, you tell yourself that the price of doing my job and helping to raise or motivate or lead a young person is that they're going to be uncomfortable and they might dislike me, but I just have to do that. In a mentor mindset, there's very high standards, so there is discomfort, but it matters to you that they succeed, and so you accompany what you do with respect. Now, I think if the question is about are we too accommodating, there's another wrong view that's opposite of the mentor mindset, and that's what I call the protector mindset. And that's very low standards, but very high support. And that, I think, legitimately should be criticized. The person who says, oh, kids they've got so much going on, they've got toxic stress, they have the anxiety and all these other things.
Let's not expect so much of them.
We can't expect very much of them. And I've interviewed so many kids, and they don't feel respected when we have those low coddling standards, and they feel afraid because they think that all these adults think they can't do anything. And that makes them afraid for their future. So what I write in the book is that if you've got the enforcer mindset, you've got half the deal. You've got the standards. Great, add the support. If you've got the protector, you've got half of it. You've got the support. Let's add the standards.
You're halfway there.
Yeah. And so I don't want to condemn and blame and shame adults any more than I think we should do that for kids. I think there's a process. And in the book, I write a lot about examples of people like Sergio who didn't start out with mentor mindset. They had to acquire it over time.
Well, David, I want to say this, and I said it backstage before you got there. I was like, oh, David Yeager is like an academic Beyonce. And it's so true. But you wrote a beautiful book. It's very personal. It's very warm. Your personality comes through. And so when do you get a book from an academic superstar who also knows how to write things that are practical, actionable advice? So thank you very much, and thank you, 92nd Street Y.
Thank you.